Thanks for joining us. This is your host, Taylor Bradley, and you're listening to the Troop HR podcast. Hello, all, and thank you for joining the podcast today. My name is Taylor Bradley, your host, and today I'm joined by Melanie Naranjo, the VP of People at Ethena, a modern compliance provider focused on building more inclusive and ethical workplaces. Melanie is also a CPO council member for Lattice and recognized as a top voice on LinkedIn. Today, we're going to discuss the exciting topic about the cost of tolerating underperformance. Before we dive in there, Melanie, welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited for this chat.
I am excited, as always, with all of the guests, but in particular, you. I've spent considerable amount of time this week looking through your LinkedIn posts, and I feel like you just need to collate all of them, put them in a book. You have a New York Times bestseller right there. It's going to be great.
Oh my God, that would be amazing. My 7th grade self would be so happy. A published book, my dream.
That's awesome. Well, I always like to start at the ground floor of our topics, which is the cost of tolerating underperformance. What I'd love to get from you is, how do we define performance? What would be that definition from you?
Oh, what a great question. I don't know if I've ever had that specifically worded in that way. I think people often focus on how do you define high performance, but how do you define performance in general? Wow, I might have to dig in a little bit. I think my off-the-cuff response would be the value that an employee is bringing to their company. And so then when you take it one step further, how do you define high performance? It's someone who is bringing high value to their company. When you define low performance, it's someone who's draining value away from the company.
And with that framework, which was a great off-the-cuff framework, by the way, what would be some ways when you're measuring that value? What are some practical ways or metrics that managers should be considering?
Okay, so I'm a big fan of this question in particular because I'm just going to say what is going on my mind right now. I think that people overcomplicate it. It's not really that complicated. In fact, at Ethena, we have boiled it down to 3 questions that we have every manager ask themselves. It is in regard to their direct report. They ask, is this person ultimately making my life easier or harder? If I could go back in time, would I hire this person again? And if they were to turn in their resignation today, how would I feel? Relieved or panicked? And I think that is really how you define performance, because it is all about the output. I'm not focusing on the nitpicky in the weeds. Like, did they do the specific thing from yesterday? Did they do this one project the way that I wanted them to? At the end of the day, we're not focused on it. I don't think that any company should be focused on inputs. They should be focused on outputs. And the reason why I think that's so helpful is because oftentimes when you focus too much on inputs, it's always all too easy to talk yourself out of doing the right thing. And what I mean by that is it's really easy to say, well, I guess they underperformed in this area, but they're really nice. Or, well, but the other day they were working really hard on that project. Or I could tell they're really trying. All those things are great. And I have all the empathy in the world. And for the record, I'm not saying that if you answer no to any of those questions, you should give the employee the axe. But I think we need to have real, open, honest conversations with ourselves and with each other around, are they ultimately driving value for the company or draining value? And if they're draining value, it's time to have a tough discussion around what needs to change in order to turn that around.
And having been a business partner for some time, that I feel is one of the most difficult pieces for managers to handle. And before we get into the folks that are doing really well on the team, what coaching do you have for managers going into that tough conversation that you just alluded to?
It's so funny you ask this because I was just talking to someone about this the other day. One of the things that I find managers really struggle with is saying the tough thing. So for example, hey, I need to have a tough discussion with you and be honest. Your performance is such that your job is currently at risk. Or maybe even one step lighter, right? Hey, you're doing okay. Like, you are performing. And also, I know that you're gunning it for a promotion. At your current rate, you're not going to be ready for promotion at our next performance review. Those are all really tough discussions to have. And managers really struggle to say those words because they feel like they are personally hurting this other person. Now, for the record, I do personally disagree with that. I think that hurting them is not telling them the thing and then surprising them with a termination, or then surprising them with, hey, just kidding. I thought, you thought you were going to get promoted today. You're not, right? That it is so much worse to not say the thing. And also I understand that it's scary and hard to say the thing. At Ethena, we still encourage our managers to say the thing, and they do. But to make things that much easier, we actually color code our feedback. So we use yellow, orange, red. Yellow means it's a nice to have. If you don't do anything, things will be fine. It will have literally no impact. It's a nice to have, but it's not going to hold you back. Orange is, listen, your job's not going to be at risk if you don't do this, but failure to improve in this area is going to limit your long-term growth opportunities, such as getting a higher salary or getting that promotion you're looking for. Red means, no. If you don't act on this and improve meaningfully quite quickly, you will lose your job. And the reason that we find that to be helpful is it's common language across the company, yellow, orange, red, such that an employee can ask, is this a yellow or an orange? This feels like a red. And it's just so much easier for a manager to say, yeah, this is a red, than to say, yes, your job is on the line. And so that's not to say that managers still don't say the thing and need to say the thing. And also on a day-to-day basis in your regular interactions, it's much easier to be able to use a coded word such as this is a red than it is to say that very tough thing.
I love how you've created almost a clinical structure to take a little bit of the emotion out of it, making it personal and just focusing on those key aspects. Now, in the spirit of the topic that we're diving into today, this will likely come as a shock to you. At times, managers may tolerate and not address performance issues.
Yep.
I know it's shocking, but let's work through the shock and get to the point here of when that occurs, what does that come at the cost of to the rest of the team?
Well, you know what? I'm going to answer this in a roundabout way. I'm going to give you the direct answer, but I think before I answer it, it's important to understand the context. Why do managers tolerate underperformance? Why do managers not say the thing or hold their employees accountable? It's not because managers don't want to do their job. It's not because they're anti the man or whatever term you want to use. It's not a willful ignorance. They see the thing, and either one of two things typically is what I find. Either they don't realize the severity of the issue, and so they take it on themselves. So, wow, they made this mistake, but it's probably because I didn't set clear enough expectations. Or, maybe my expectations are too high of them. Or, they make some other sort of excuse, like, they must have just been really busy, right? Or it is genuinely, they just don't realize that it is their job to say the thing. So they think it is their job to do everything in their power to make it work, as opposed to, no, it's your job to help empower them. It is also your job to know when, now it's just time to have a tough discussion, right? It's a two-way street. And sometimes managers, especially from a place of goodness, right? They take it on themselves and they just assume it's never the employee's fault and I'm the failure if I can't turn it around, right? So I think it's really important to understand there's all these things going on. It's not this thing that they're doing intentionally or on purpose. It truly is. There's just so much nuance and discomfort. And also it's scary to have these conversations. This is literally someone's livelihood when it gets to the point that your job is at risk. Now, to answer your more direct question, which is what is the impact? The impact is significant, not just to the employee, but to the manager who's having to manage this, to the team around that employee, and to the overall business. I'll try and break that down just a little bit more as briefly as possible, but I do think it's important to highlight some of the specifics. If you think about the employee themselves, first of all, if the manager's not giving them feedback, they may very well not even know that this is an area, an opportunity for improvement. And so that's just, if you think about it, that could be years of missed growth for them because their manager never said, hey, do you realize that when you're presenting, you actually read directly from the screen instead of presenting more organically? And it makes people less engaged with your content, right? Because they never said that thing, that person's going to continue doing that for years. Had you just said the thing, they could have improved, right? But now if you think about the manager, how much time and effort they are spending correcting for that person's mistake, complaining to their manager about the issue, apologizing on behalf of their direct report to other people who are bringing up concerns, to the rest of that team who has to interact with that employee. Maybe they're frustrated. Maybe they're resentful. If you think about high performers in particular, high performers get the least amount of attention because it's sort of like, oh, you're doing great. I don't need to give you any feedback, even though, of course, high performers have many areas of growth themselves, namely, striving for perfectionism and not knowing how to prioritize because they just say yes to everything, not knowing when it's time to ask for help because they just figure they'll figure it out. So they work a 13-hour day instead of realizing like, actually, you should be working smarter, not harder, right? High performers, I could go on a whole rant about high performers, but if you think about high performers, you're going to lose your high performers because what are they doing? They're carrying the extra weight of this other person because high performers tend to think the way to be a high performer is to never complain and just keep working till I burn out, right? And then finally, the business, right? The business is suffering as this person is making all these mistakes, not being as high value as they could be, not growing with the rest of the market, with the rest of the team, with the rest of the company, especially if you're in a high growth startup. Every day, that company is a different company than they were the day before. So there's just a myriad of ways in which low performers really negatively impact the company and people around them. And I'm not saying that they're doing this intentionally. I'm not saying that makes them a bad person, but unaddressed, there's just this cascading list of problems that happen if it goes unaddressed.
In some of that collateral damage that you've described, I've also seen it have caustic effects on the rest of the team, where those high performers may lose confidence in the manager, which makes them a flight risk. So it's really interesting, that cascading effect that you've described there. I've also learned through my career that managers like to have simple tools. The ones that you've described already, I think many of our listeners are going to jot those down. I know I am. But some of the other questions that you've mentioned in LinkedIn posts to embed into your one-on-ones that managers have, one of them that I'm going to paraphrase here was, which one of your projects is the lowest ROI, and what if we cut that? What would that look like? Also, how many days are you feeling stress, 4 or 5 out of 5 in a month? Would you have any other guidance, or would you like to elaborate on some of those questions that managers should be asking on a routine basis?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought those up because really what those questions get at is the reality that far too many managers and direct reports fall into a cycle of autopilot where they view their one-on-ones as times for status checks. And the reason why I think that's problematic is you could do a status check over Slack. I don't need to spend 30 minutes on a call with you to understand where you are in every project. Just send that to me via Slack or email, whatever mode of communication you prefer. Async. Async is asynchronous for anyone who's not familiar with that lingo. What managers should be doing in their one-on-ones is proactively rooting out underlying issues and exploring opportunities for optimization. That's the kind of thing that you can't quite as effectively do over email or Slack. Also, because just from an EQ perspective, when you aren't looking at someone face to face, it's just so much harder to interpret body language, tone, intent. And so what those questions really get at is, are you proactively exploring whether or not this partnership is as effective as it could be? And are you proactively setting the tone for the kind of behavior and thought processes you want your direct report to have? I say that particular note because think about an employee who is just strolling along, waiting for feedback from their manager and assuming, well, no feedback means I'm doing great. That's not a proactive thinker. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. I was that person. I have been that person. Okay. I thought, come into work and you're going to tell me what you need and I'm just going to do. I'm an executor. I do as I'm told, but that's not proactive thinking. And so it's on the manager to partner with their direct report and help them start proactively thinking, hey, how do I manage up? How do I question and make sure, am I being the best employee that I can be? Am I bringing the highest value? Am I growing? What is it that I want to achieve? What steps do I need to take in order to achieve that? And so those questions hopefully help encourage some of these deeper conversations. And I would argue help anticipate and even mitigate some of those tougher performance discussions because you're checking in every step along the way versus waiting for it to become a situation where now it's damage control because I didn't proactively understand or root out that, oh, you struggle to speak up in these situations. Oh, you are having a lot of stress right now and you're not prioritizing effectively. You're just saying yes to everything. And in 3 weeks, you're going to have 3 glaring mistakes because everything slipped through the cracks because it was too much to handle, right? I could help avoid that if I'm having these proactive discussions versus, la-di-da, we're just doing status checks. And then 3 weeks from now, I find out nothing got done.
And one of the unique things that you mentioned in hyper growth setting is when you're a head of people or in your position as well, I'm sure you're interacting a lot with the CEO and giving them guidance on their direct reports. So we'll talk about prior organizations. So we're not talking about current, but in your experience briefing CEOs on how to find that balance between empowerment and accountability with executives, how do you tailor that advice for those individuals?
I think at the end of the day, it comes down to two things: curiosity and expectation setting. And so the first question is, have you set clear expectations for the outcomes that you are trying to achieve? If you haven't, that's step one. You need to have a conversation and find out if there's misalignment. If there's misalignment, either you need to lay down the rule and say, hey, this is what I'm looking for as a CEO. Are you down with that or are you not? If you're not, possible that this is not the place for you. Or you might realize like, oh, I was not approaching this correctly. Thanks for pushback, right? But at the end of the day, expectation setting can't be, well, it's a give and take. There needs to be one set of expectations and everybody needs to agree with those, period. Second is curiosity, right? Especially in the example, let's say you do get pushback, or let's say someone's not doing something that you want them to do. Ask why. Hey, I noticed this thing didn't get done. You could approach with, I can't believe it didn't get done. Why didn't you do this? Oh my goodness, blah, blah, blah. Or you could say, walk me through the process. What do I need to know? What context am I missing? Why didn't it get done? What blockers am I unaware of? Right now, you can start to have a holistic discussion. Now, for the record, that discussion may lead the conversation to a point where you decide, you know what? We need to reset expectations. Perhaps my expectations were unrealistic, so on and so forth, right? But that's a conversation that happens after you've had, a baseline discussion around what the needs of the role are. As I'm speaking, there's a third thing that comes to mind, which is focusing on outputs, not inputs. And I think actually this is the most important thing. So it's funny that was the third one I added to the list. Where I think people can go wrong is that they forget that there are multiple ways to achieve the same goal. I always say there are multiple ways to get 4. 2 plus 2, 1 plus 3, 0 plus 4, 2.5 plus 1.5. There's so many different ways, but oftentimes people get stuck in the how and not the what. And so I would recommend for any CEO or executive who's really struggling with this, take a step back and ask yourself, are you focusing on the outputs or the inputs? Because if they are achieving the outputs that you set forth in your expectations for them, it doesn't really matter how they achieved it. Now, there's a caveat, obviously, if they're being a jerk while they do this, that is different, right? But that then is in direct contrast to some of the expectations you set around values of the company, right? But outside of that, right, if they're just doing it in a different way than you would like for them to do it, at that point, it may be time to take a step back and realize you hired these people for a reason, right? It's because they're the expert in their field, not you. And so are you going to trust them as long as they continue to achieve on their goals? I would hope yes.
And early on in my career, and a point of vulnerability here is that was something I struggled with as a manager early on, is letting go, letting people have their creativity to drive those outputs. But goodness, when you make that pivot, it makes your job so much easier to trust your folks and empower them in that way. So in the last few minutes here, I want to end going through the personal journey, and then of course we'll get to the lightning round of questions. But one of the things that you had mentioned in one of your posts was something that resonated with me: optimizing for perfection instead of focusing on experimentation. Would you be open to elaborating on where that fit in your journey and how you worked through that?
Oh, yeah. This was my biggest downfall early on. And I have a lot of empathy because I think I was talking about high performers earlier on. I think this is most overachievers' biggest growth opportunity. They are so focused on perfection, probably because in school that's what they were praised for, that they don't think about working smarter, not harder. And when I think about experimentation, the value that brings over perfection, I'll give a very specific example. Say that you are rolling out a project and to make it perfect, in your opinion, perfect at the time, right? The most perfect that you can have at that moment without feedback. It takes you 5 months. So you roll it out after 5 months. And at the 5-month mark, you're like, I did the best of my ability. I worked to 100%, maybe 110. You roll it out. Guess what? It's a flop. And it took you 5 months to find out that it wasn't going to work, right? People could tell that you worked really hard. You spent a lot of time on it, but you didn't achieve what you wanted. Or let's say you did achieve what you wanted, right? It was pretty good. It's pretty good, but obviously there's always room to improve. So you don't get that feedback till 5 months into the project. Now let's try again. We start over. This is someone who's not going to optimize for perfection. They optimize for experimentation. They roll out the project after 2 weeks. They know it's only 80% of the way there. It's not the best project and they know it. There are problems, there are glaring issues, but this is the best they can do in 2 weeks and they're optimizing for speed and experimentation. They roll it out. At the 2-week mark, they get a ton of feedback, including things that they had not previously considered. Now they can iterate on that. Another 2 weeks, they roll it out again. It's even better. By month 2, by month 3, it is probably going to be 10 times better than what it would have been at 5 months on your own. And on top of that, you didn't piss off a bunch of people along the way because you took so long to get it done. And I say that very intentionally because HR is, unfortunately, we have a reputation of being very slow and employees see that. And when you take so long to do a thing, what's happening over time is the expectation is building. You're taking so long that at this point, it's almost impossible to live up to expectation because by God, this better be the most perfect project ever that it took you this long to roll it out. Versus you say very transparently to your employees, I know it's not perfect. We want to make progress on this. We're going to start, and our ask to you is give us feedback, and I promise you we will make it better in the next iteration. That is just always so much better received, and you will learn so much faster along the way. So I always optimize for experimentation over perfection now. At this point in my career, it took me many years to get here, but I am very happy that I have, and it has radically changed my approach to work, and also it has dramatically improved my own growth and success.
In following that product development cycle, I think is also a great way to bond with your R&D leaders. They will engage in that. They understand that.
People really like feeling like they're part of the solution. And if you can bring people along with you, you're going to build that buy-in and you're going to get those supporters along the way.
Exactly. So one final question for you, and then we'll get into the quick lightning round to wrap us up here, is I saw that you did a stint of teaching English in China. I'm just curious, in that experience that you had with that, what was one interesting takeaway that you had?
Oh my gosh, how funny that you asked that, because I actually have an answer. And just so you all know, if you're listening, I didn't know this question was coming. So this is a really fun one. So I taught English, as you mentioned, and it was my first teaching experience. And first of all, it showed me just how much I love teaching. But the thing that I learned from that experience most was realizing that everybody has such different learning styles. And that, in my opinion, I was just talking to somebody about this literally 2 hours ago. When you are training, in my opinion, about 30% of the value comes from the content and about 70% of the value comes from the how, the structure, the engagement. And so I learned very early on, you can have great quality content, but if it's delivered in a boring, unengaging lecture style way, no one's going to listen, no one's going to process. Now I have since then radically shifted my approach. I focus on what is going to make someone engaged? What is going to make someone feel involved? How am I going to get that person's buy-in? And then I just need 3 snappy tips. 3 snappy takeaways is so much more valuable than an hour-long lecture that you fell asleep halfway through.
Yes, this is my slow clapping starting moment there for the listeners. That is fantastic advice. All right, we'll transition to the lightning round to close this out here. The first question for you, the best career advice you've received in one sentence.
Oh boy. Be open to new ways of solving old problems.
Love it. All right. Favorite HR tool or book right now?
Oh, this one has been the same for a while. I just haven't found anything better. It's a book called The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni. It just radically changed how I thought about organizational development.
Excellent. We'll put that in the description for our listeners to look at. One hot take HR opinion.
Oh no, you're really going to put me on the spot here, huh? I think that we often work harder, not smarter. And I'm eager to see a shift over the next couple of years as we innovate in lower lift, higher impact ways of solving the biggest HR challenges.
Couldn't agree more. Love that one. All right. The final question. How can our listeners connect with you?
Follow me on LinkedIn. I'm all over the place and I'm often hosting happy hours. So if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll see an invite. Come join me. I just hung out with a bunch of people in San Francisco. I'm going to be in New York hosting another happy hour next week. I'm around. Follow me on LinkedIn. We'll hang out. We'll be friends.
That's awesome. And for all the listeners, go check out her posts while they're still free, because that's going to be a New York Times bestseller at some point. But thank you, Melanie, for attending today, giving your feedback. It's been fantastic speaking with you.
Thank you. Same here. Really great chatting with you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Troop HR podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe and leave a 5-star rating. If you would like to learn more about our community, please visit troophr.com. In the meantime, keep living the dream.